As you can see, we are being recorded, and I believe that ISOCARP and UEF will provide the recordings and the slides at a later time. However, we've attempted in our presentations to provide speakers' email addresses and links to references that would be relevant to each topic. This particular session is sponsored by the Climate and Sustainability Working Group of the International Division of the American Planning Association. We are a group of practicing academic and public official planners in the US, numbering somewhere between 35 and 40,000 planners. And we are a partner of ISOCARP, and we're a member of the Global Planning Network like ISOCARP also is. So as you know, extreme heat is a big problem, very well known, very published about this past year or two. It's not only an urban problem, it's a regional problem, a national problem, a global problem. A lot of attention is being paid to mitigation. There's some frustration with how fast that's moving, and it makes for local governments and their officials and planners, resilience and adaptation are very key and new initiative. So how can planners help, and what are some useful tools for that? That's what this session is about. We know that the ISOCARP and UEF Congress audience is very broad, so we hope we've put on a group of speakers and topics that addresses those broad interests. We're representing a variety of organizations, NGOs like ICLEI and the U.S. Green Building Council, different universities, Arizona and Rutgers, which is the State University of New Jersey, and donors such as IFC. We're hoping to address a range of locations, their respective heat situations, and different planning scales from individual building up to town and region, and different phases of planning from initial vulnerability assessments to actual implementation. To save time, since we have so many speakers and so little time, an hour, although we may possibly go over an hour since we're the last session, I would ask you to please put your questions in the chat. And when you do so, to identify the speaker you're addressing. And I would ask our speakers to in turn try to address those questions after they've given their talk in the chat as well. And then we'll see what remains to be addressed on a more collective basis. So I want to introduce very briefly the speakers. Hold on a second. Can't find my cursor. So my name's Tim Van Epp. I'm a FAICP. That means I'm an old guy with a lot of experience. I'm a former chair of the International Division of the APA. I have a small company which still exists and still working under, called Eurasia Environmental Associates, and I'll be, of course, the moderator. Nguyen recently joined IFC. She's a lead AP certified. She's the representative of the APA International Division to the Vietnam Urban Planning and Development Association, and has a lot of experience and background in climate adaptation and resilience. And she'll be speaking about the situation in Ho Chi Minh City. Rena Viebeck is Climate Change Program Manager for ICLEI in their Canadian office. She manages adaptation projects and facilitates numerous workshops with local government staff, elected officials, experts in climate change, and community stakeholders. She's often found leading the development of climate change adaptation plans for local governments. James Shope, PhD, is applied climatologist, research associate for Rutgers University in New Jersey, and their Climate Change Resource Center and Department of Environmental Sciences. He'll introduce the center's recently released Heat Vulnerability Index for New Jersey. He's an earth and environmental scientist whose work addresses hazards due to climate change and sea level rise. Lad Keith, PhD, is assistant professor in the School of Landscape Architecture and Planning at the University of Arizona. He'll present the Plan Integration for Resilience Scorecard for heat, an approach communities can use to analyze how heat mitigation policies are integrated across plans and to identify opportunities to better target heat mitigation policies to the hottest and most vulnerable areas. Lastly, Vatsal Bhatt is going to join us a little bit later. He's Vice President for LEAD for Cities and Communities of the U.S. Green Building Council, which is active globally, not just in the U.S. He'll summarize the heat resilience planning of 2 cities, one in the U.S. and one in Italy, which have been certified under USGBC's new LEAD for Cities and Communities program. So again, in the chat, you'll find longer versions of these bios, and each one will have the email address of the speakers. And if you have any questions about the APA or the international division, you can address those to me, and my email is in there as well. So without further ado, I'll put Mai on, considering that it's, I think, midnight her time in Vietnam, and I'm sure she's willing to speak nonetheless. Go ahead, Mai, and ask me to.
Thank you, Tim. Thank you. Hello, everyone. My name is Mai. As Tim introduced me, I have some experience in green building and climate resilience for the last decade. And I'm so thrilled to be here today to join the panels and to share a conversation with you. So welcome to Vietnam. Look at those photos. Yes, we cannot be more creative. And if you happen to visit Vietnam during summertime, you probably will be in the ninja movies, and well, you cannot see people's face on the street. Next, please. I would like to start with Ho Chi Minh City's land surface temperatures over the years. So Ho Chi Minh City is the city in the southern part of Vietnam. So on the map of the left-hand side, you can see the map from 1989 over the 96 and then 02 and 06. You can see the red areas enlarge over time. So which means the land surface temperatures increase. And the second phase is 2010, 2015, and 2020. So there's some record that from 2010 to 2015, the minimum LSD increased from 9 Celsius to 24 Celsius. So on average, every year, LSD increased from 1 to 1.5 Celsius. To give you some context about the population in Ho Chi Minh City. So during the period of 89 to 06, the population almost doubled from 3 million to 5.3 million. And increased from 6 million to 8.6 million during the past decades. Next, please. So of course, urban development and has a link to his island. If I take a look at the map on the right-hand side, you can see the purple areas, which is the built-up areas in between 1990 to 2015. And during the periods of 89 to 1999, there's a total numbers of 9,600 hectares of built-up area. So if we compare this built-up areas map with the heat map, we can see exactly where the city as enlarged is also where the land surface areas temperatures increase. Next, please. So the previous one, please. So to give you some more numbers, Vietnam is a quite long country. There's Hanoi in the north, which is the capital cities of Vietnam, and Ho Chi Minh City is in the south. And Hanoi has a humid subtropical dry winter climate, meaning that it has 4 seasons. The lowest temperature recorded is around 7 Celsius, and the high is around 44 Celsius. So between 1996 and 2016, the land surface temperatures increased from 26 Celsius to 43 Celsius. Meanwhile, in Ho Chi Minh City, which had a tropical wet and dry climate, the lowest temperatures around 19 Celsius and the highest around 40 Celsius. The land surface temperatures increased from 27 Celsius to 30 Celsius. So there's a differences, and there's many factors contribute different in increasing between Hanoi and Ho Chi Minh City. But I think one of the factor is the humidity, because Hanoi has a relatively high humidity, it's only around more than 80%, typically around 87%. So if you visit Vietnam during the summer, I would recommend you to visit Ho Chi Minh City. Well, you feel more comfortable. Next, please. So of course, urban heat effect has some impacts. It increased the heat stress and heat risk. So some calculation of Ho Chi Minh City show that the heat island effect increased 0.5 Celsius to 0.8 Celsius to the temperatures of the city, which also have the negative impacts on the labor productivities. And according to Ministry of Labor of Vietnam, 28 Celsius is a maximum temperature for safe heavy labels with the humidity greater than 80%. Also, it have the effects on the thermal comfort, public health, and increase the energy consumption. So 1 degree hotter will increase 0.5% to 8.5% in electricity demand. So all of these will have the human health and have the significant influence on human health and the economy. So take a look at the map on the right-hand side. The upper one is the heat risk map of this is the historical data from 1995 to 2014. You can with the dark red is where the area has a higher heat risk, and the lower one is the forecast for 2020 and 2039 with the climate change scenarios of 1.5 Celsius increase. So you can see the blue circle is where the heat risk increase is either enlarged of the dark red, or it changed from orange to red. So it's already happening. Next, please. So look at the Ho Chi Minh City. What is the current situation and practices? You can look at the photo on the left side. Around a couple of years ago, 2017, the city decided to cut off all those trees to build road and bridge. So we went from the upper picture to the lower pictures. So many people was upset about it. Many people still upset about it. Well, it's the reality. And the second photo is the new park along the Saigon River. It's just launched last year in March, and you can see there's a little bit of green areas, but in my opinion, it doesn't contribute much to reduce his island effect, and there's no tree, so people cannot enjoy the park during daytime, and it's over like crowded during nighttime is another problem. So of course the causes of heat island in Ho Chi Minh City and in Vietnam in general is because of the rapid urbanization with the concrete build up and infill, and also low green coverage rate, Ho Chi Minh City only has 7.7 square meter of green areas per person compared to Singapore, which is 30 and 41 is so on. So the current temporary solution of the city is to increase the green area per person to 6.3 square meter, but the reality only reached 1.6, which is far lower than the plan. So in terms of individual house practices, so people paint their roof white and install solar panels. Next, please. So you can see the photo here and the green circles. I just took this photo from my apartment. You can see this is work in progress. People painting their roof white. Yeah, so what else is missing for Ho Chi Minh City to deal with heat island effect problem? So we need more attention and awareness from planners and policymakers and other stakeholders. And of course, we need tools to measure and plan, because in Vietnam now, we don't have a friendly tool for planner in order to do so. And of course, we need a holistic and comprehensive plan to cover multiple aspects of urban development, including landscape, hardscape, what kind of material, water survey, ventilation, where to plant trees, what type of tree should we plant to have the good effect and to reduce the heat island and so on. So today I'm looking forward to further discussion with anyone who have interest in Vietnam and also his island, and looking forward to learn from other panelists about their tools. Maybe we can use them in Vietnam. And if you would like to have some conversation, here's is the QR code to my LinkedIn and my contacts. Please feel free to reach out. Next, please.
I'll give them a second to photograph the QR code. Okay.
So this is the final slide. This is my own personal observation. You can see in Hanoi, the roof covers almost only green and red, which is darker, while in Ho Chi Minh City, the covers a little bit lighter. So I don't know the reason for this. Maybe vendors in the north, they prefer red and green, vendor in the south, they prefer white. That's why I live in Ho Chi Minh City. So this is the final fun pictures, and I would like to thank you for your time, and have a great day. Thank you.
Thank you, Mai. Rena, I think you're up next.
Yeah, thank you, Tim. And thank you, May, for that was a great presentation and got us off to a great start. So as Tim introduced me at the beginning, my name is Rena Viebeck. I'm with ICLEI Canada, and pleased to be joining all of you here today. I'm going to be focusing on heat planning resources with examples from in and around Canadian municipalities. Next slide, please. As the Climate Change Program Manager for ICLEI Canada, I thought I'd take a moment to give a little context on what the work is that we do. We support local action on climate change, so including net zero, resilience, sustainability, and biodiversity goals. In general, we're providing programming, training, resources, consulting, and I often think of myself as a facilitator on all of those different sustainability issues. We bring together a variety of stakeholders across government, across industry, academia, and not-for-profit community, of which we are a part of. ICLEI, which is Local Governments for Sustainability, is a global network of more than 2,500 local and regional governments, all committed to sustainable urban development, and of which ICLEI Canada is a regional office to support this work. So next slide, please. My presentation is going to jump directly into, as I mentioned, the strategies that address urban heat resilience. I love this graphic that I was fortunate to find. It helps to quickly summarize the story of heat contributions so that we can get rolling with the conversation and what we can do about it. And it shows that all the systems are impacted. So in this holistic whole systems approach, we can see that there's the environmental, infrastructure, social and economic systems. And therefore, it's really critical for all communities to fully integrate all those systems in addressing urban heat in all of their work. Next slide, please. And of course, today's conversation, we're specifically looking at what we can do about urban heat, and where the majority of our populations are now residing. So this includes many of our populations that are most vulnerable to heat, as well as many other climate impacts. This is children, elderly, pregnant women, outdoor workers, unhoused populations, those with chronic or existing diseases or living with mental illness, as well as urban Indigenous populations. And this graphic just helps show sort of the story that we know, that it's hotter in urban centers, and that's where our people are, and often where we are. Next slide, please. I'm going to present 3 groupings of actions or strategies that communities can take and are taking to address urban heat. It's going to be non-structural. This includes social or economic measures that center around communication, education, and planning. Then, of course, green infrastructure solutions, so working with nature, and gray infrastructure strategies, improving building and public infrastructure. And I'd like to emphasize that the reality is that urban planners have influence in and on all of the components that I'll be presenting, whether it be through bylaws, zoning changes, zoning and ordinances, building codes, official plans, development permits, land conservation, and really more. And it emphasizes the need for all of us to work across city departments or organization departments and across those silos to get all hands on deck and get messages out, and support each other where needed. So again, emphasizing back to that first slide, that whole systems approach across all of the different areas. So let's dive in. Next slide, please. We'll start with non-structural strategies. And next slide. My first example here is looking at assessing and mapping the vulnerabilities of many Canadians. And I know one of our other presenters is going to also touch on this, but this image here is of one example of vulnerability mapping across Canadian cities that's been done by work at Laval University. And there are others. This one in particular is free to access. And wherever you are, I suggest starting by looking at these available mapping and vulnerability assessments, so that you can prioritize your work and action that address reducing impacts of extreme heat. Yes, this work involves planners and also working with IT departments, GIS departments, and of course, community partners and community services to target that heat planning in locations where those are most impacted. Next slide, please. So again, we're under the non-structural strategies, and of course, using education and outreach campaigns. There's excellent examples out there of communities, states, in our case in Canada, those are provinces or regions that have developed toolkits on why, when, how, and what to communicate in regards to heat. This doesn't need to be necessarily a blank slate when you start this work. And these actions, of course, obviously involve working with communications department, but often are also inclusive of planners. And next slide just has some examples of messaging. There is no need to reinvent the wheel. There are so many graphics and resources out there waiting to be used, waiting to be shared. So if you don't have the budget, if you don't have the graphic design skills, that's okay. Start sharing the message and use and spread those resources as needed. Next slide. One particular useful and unique example comes from a municipality we worked with in Southern Ontario. This is the township of Halton Hills, where they made an easy to use and interactive online virtual home. So this shows homeowners very easily the many ways in which they can reduce their impacts of climate change, as well as the impacts they're experiencing. So mitigation and adaptation sides, including actions around heat. Another example comes from the City of Calgary, who also recently released a climate resilient home handbook. And there's opportunity here for all of us to ask ourselves, when it comes to these strategies for homeowners that we're encouraging, is our community supporting these initiatives? How can we if we're not? And are there potentially walls in place that need to be removed, such as, tenants in rental buildings not being allowed to install air conditioning units, which exists? Just one example of making sure that our work and what we have control over is not preventing taking action on these. Next slide, please. Setting up a community support program for vulnerable populations. So this photo here is an example from the city of Victoria on our west coast. It's the Victoria's Neighbor Hubs. They provide a meeting place during extreme weather events, including extreme heat. They provide emergency power, some shade, and some information on where to get more services, such as cooling centers. This strategy here could also include creating a list of people and their contact information that self-identify as vulnerable, and so that there is a check-in system that exists, excuse me, such as they're doing in Beaconsfield, Quebec, a portion of Montreal, where the library calls each of these self-identified vulnerable individuals to check in on them. So these strategies often involve working with community planners, as well as community services departments, to determine where these strategies should be implemented. Next slide. This is the opportunity that planners can take to require green and gray infrastructure, such as trees and vegetated walls, playground and parking lot shade standards, reflective and green roofs, backup power generation to maintain air conditioning and water supply, as well as design for passive building standards, or even just natural ventilation and upgrades to insulation. So this is really the toolbox of, I would call them sticks that planners can use and pull from that toolbox in order to require new developments, retrofits, urban planning changes, all of those opportunities to incorporate heat sensitive infrastructure. So use those tools as requirements. So an example is in 2006, Port Coquitlam, which is in BC on our west coast, was the first Canadian municipality to require green roofs for commercial industrial buildings larger than a certain size. Many other cities, such as Windsor, Ontario, are working with improving their standards, as well as on city buildings and parks, so setting the example within their own infrastructure. So using reflective and vegetated surfaces. And let's also take into account building heights when we're thinking of this, and the relationship of shade and shadow to create comfortable urban environments. Next slide. Similar to the last strategy, this one is more on using carrots instead of sticks or incentives, as we would refer to them, to encourage passive cooling and reducing waste heat. So this could include subsidizing tree planting or home retrofits. Often this improves energy efficiencies of buildings and spaces, and they, of course, also contribute to reducing heat impacts. So an example here would be from the city of Ottawa. They have a Trees and Trust program, providing trees to be planted on private property in exchange for 3 years of tree care, and thus providing the property owner with the advantages of having a tree. This strategy can often involve planners working with their parks and forestry departments, and of course building departments, to include building design standards. Next slide. Not only are are there opportunities to develop an extreme heat emergency plan, but also include elements such as extending opening hours of beaches, pools, water parks, opening cooling and refreshment centers, offering air-conditioned public transportation, and also that gets to cooling centers, and offering free drinking water at city facilities. We're in particular loving, and I'm highlighting here, the work coming out of City of Hamilton that's working at requiring multi-unit residential buildings to have a maximum indoor temperature. We're going to look quickly at some green infrastructure strategies now. So next slide. And then the next slide again. These are often really simple in concept: protect, plant, and maintain urban trees, but they are nuanced in design and delivery. This is where urban planners have the opportunity to work to support green urban design guidelines, requiring the planting, protection, and maintenance of trees. One great example that comes to mind is City of Thunder Bay, which developed and implemented a citizen pruner program copied from Ithaca, New York. So I encourage you to look at that. Next slide. Protecting and expanding vegetated areas around water not only manages for heat, but of course we're going to get the multiple co-benefits that improve air quality and reduce flooding. There's also great software programs out there such as iTree that can quickly spit out information for a municipality as to total value of trees per tree and per general community. We get a lot of communities working with their planning departments to protect and expand vegetated areas. I particularly love community-driven depave projects that are done by citizens across the country. All right, next slide is gray infrastructure. Yeah, and thank you. So this is going to be working with your engineers, your transportation departments, infrastructure, and so on, adjusting policies and plans. There's, of course, an opportunity to look at how people move around, but also, of course, urban planning, encouraging densification and public active transportation in order to reduce road dependence and vehicle use. So this can include supporting actions such as developing mixed-use neighborhoods and restructuring the use of motorized vehicles, restricting, of course, to just urban use. Restricting the use of vehicles within urban centers. Next slide. These two strategies often require the guidance of planning departments and public health authorities. The example I've shown here is, and can be as simple as what they're doing in Sudbury, Greater Sudbury, Ontario, which is installing umbrella holders on benches so that both during rain, but also extreme heat, you can just put your own umbrella into that holder. Next slide. And of course, on hot days, that evaporating water to cool the surrounding air temperatures and also provide direct water access. This example comes from Niagara Falls, where it was being enjoyed by some youth on an extremely hot summer day. Planning for where these are located and who has access to them is definitely within the wheelhouse of planners, and considering how they're spatially distributed around communities. So my last slide here is just a list of resources. Next slide, and will be shared post the presentation, so you have some links. And my last slide is just a big thank you for letting me share some of those resources, a real smorgasbord from across Canadian communities. I'll hand it back to you, Tim. Thanks.
Thank you, Rena. Very comprehensive. I'm going to use every single slide in my own work. James, it's your turn.
All right. Thank you very much, Tim. So as Rena mentioned, we're going to be delving into looking at a vulnerability index for New Jersey. So getting into the nitty-gritty of what we consider when we think about a vulnerability index, specifically for a climate hazard like extreme heat. And then references to some other climate change tools that you may find useful, or you may want to implement a similar system in your own communities. So a little bit about me. I'm here at Rutgers. I'm in the Department of Environmental Sciences. I recently just had a title change, so I'm an assistant extension specialist in climate services here, but still an applied climatologist. And the work that I've done here will be reflective of my time with the New Jersey Climate Change Resource Center, also at Rutgers, which is a legislatively mandated center here at Rutgers that provides climate change relevant information, actionable science, and documentation for planners, decision makers, and individual citizens here in the state of New Jersey. Next, please. So let's think a little bit about New Jersey, the state of New Jersey itself. So as far as US states go, it's pretty small. It's not the smallest, but certainly in the lower category. But it has a lot of variation in the hazards that it's exposed to, and that goes for heat hazards as well. So on the right here, I have an image of the projected change in the number of days where temperatures will exceed 95 degrees, that's 35 Celsius, by 2060 under high climate change. So it's additional numbers of days. And what you would maybe expect to see is that New Jersey, being relatively small, would have a very ubiquitous response, like it would be about the same everywhere. But that's not what we find when we do look at our climate projections. On the right, you can see that in some areas along the coast, those numbers of days don't increase very dramatically, whereas more in the center part of New Jersey, it increases by upwards of 30 days. So we expect to see a very high degree of climate change in terms of extremes and extreme heat here in New Jersey, but it's not distributed equally everywhere. Now, on the left here, we have the US Centers for Disease Control and Prevention's Social Vulnerability Index. And this Social Vulnerability Index combines a number of demographic, social, and financial, frankly, factors that all can you go back, please?
I'm sorry.
That all contribute to what makes a community vulnerable to any real shock or stressor. That could be a disaster like a hurricane. It could be not a natural disaster. It could be like a terrorist attack. So it's a very wide catch-all for vulnerability. And so what we also notice here is that throughout the state, as you would expect to see in a lot of places, that's also not homogeneous. There's a lot of heterogeneity in who are the most vulnerable populations throughout the state in their terms of their geographic distributions. So here on the left, we can see the lowest vulnerabilities in yellow, the highest vulnerabilities in dark blue. And those dark blue values tend to be aggregated in our cities and then into southern New Jersey. And I'll get into why that is as we go through the presentation. But basically, we want to think about how can we look at both these hazards and this geographic distribution together. Next, please. So if we're focusing in directly on heat vulnerability, I really like how Lim and Skidmore here in this graphic present understanding heat vulnerability and its effects. So you have an initial hazard, such as a heat wave, and that's filtered through local environmental characteristics, population characteristics, demographics, and socioeconomic factors before you actually start having that societal impact. So that shows how local areas really have a unique response to any sort of extreme heat event. And then, of course, once you have that information, you can then start generating your mitigation and adaptation strategies. Now, when we consider heat vulnerability and creating an index, what we focus on are those 3 hexagons that I've outlined in red. So those are what we call our indicators of vulnerability and those bins. So next, please. So let's break those bins down. And they're broadly 3 categories. There's exposure, which is your local environment. So your impervious cover that increases the urban heat island exposure. Local air quality. Air quality tends to get worse on extreme hot days, and just your local climate. Then we have sensitivity for our communities, and this is their intrinsic response to extreme heat, basically their negative health outcome from it. And so looking at this indicator, you can look at the proportion of your community that is older or younger populations. They tend to have a worse response to extreme heat because older and younger folks don't thermoregulate their bodies quite as well. Number of people working outside in the community, folks with chronic health conditions. Certain health conditions like heart disease or diabetes or asthma are all exacerbated on extreme heat days. And then people living in older homes. The proportion of older homes is a good indicator of two things. One, lack of central air conditioning, as well as potentially less effective insulation here in the state of New Jersey. And then finally, we have this adaptive capacity component. And this is effectively how well can a community or a person respond to, anticipate, or make steps to improve from any sort of shock or stress. In this case, we're looking at extreme heat. And that's primarily determined by socioeconomic status, financial ability to deal with this particular hazard. But there's also a demographic component. So when I look at an indicator of who may be vulnerable to extreme heat, typically non-white populations here in New Jersey are also much more vulnerable due to historic underinvestment in those communities for extreme heat, and as well as linguistic isolation. Basically, people who don't speak English very well may not be able to get the information they need because a lot of our heat information within the state is distributed primarily in English, sometimes in Spanish. And New Jersey is a very diverse state in terms of languages spoken, and it may not be getting everyone. And then finally, folks without health insurance, because if they don't have health insurance, they may not actually seek help during an emergency. So where all of these overlap and combine is how we determine our heat vulnerability for a specific community. So we're looking at the proportions of each one of these indicators. Next, please. And my goal with a heat vulnerability index, and the goal of any vulnerability index, is to create a single metric that can allow someone to quickly summarize the factors contributing to worse heat health outcomes in this case. So the goal here is to limit the total number of indicators. You can imagine there's entire laundry lists of things that can make someone or a community more vulnerable to heat, but you need to generalize it to some degree to make it applicable across a wider range, like in this case, looking at a state. I do some data transformation that I'm going to show you in the next slide. And then the goal here is a relative comparison within, in this case, our census tracts throughout New Jersey. That's dictated by the resolution that the data are available at. And it's important to note that this is relative. So many states or cities or other countries have their own variations on heat vulnerability index. This isn't comparable to what they do. Generally, these are all relative to their geographic extents. And if you're interested in looking at the methodology for the heat vulnerability index, I've included the URL here for our New Jersey HazAdapt toolset, where the methodology is available. So next. So as I mentioned, I have those indicators that I outlined before by census tract throughout the entire state. And some of those data are not necessarily play the best when you're trying to create an index. So here on the left, we have the number of census tracts throughout the state versus the percent of the people within those that live below the federal poverty line. You can see that's a very skewed distribution. It has a long tail pulling out to the right. And if you were to take this and say average it with a different statistic, you may end up with values that are overrepresentative of poverty in this case. So for each one of those indicators I've outlined before and the ones that contribute to those larger bins, I first transform it to a normal distribution that you can see on the right using a Box-Cox transformation. And the goal here is simply to get rid of the over-representation of skew effects or outlying points. There's always going to be some outliers, some screwball cases that can throw off the entire analysis if you're not careful. So next. So to show the flow chart for how the heat vulnerability index is constructed, for each one of those big categories, exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity, each one of those indicators is transformed to that normal distribution. And it's standardized such that they're all within the same units. Some of these come in as percentages, some come in as raw counts. It's just important that they're all in the same value structure. And then it's a really simple averaging scheme from there. You average within those categories to get composite scores for each one of those larger groups, and then standardize those again and average them to get the heat vulnerability index. So this is a fairly straightforward process in terms of the computation here. And the rationale for this is I want people to be able to understand what's going on. There's a number of different ways to construct vulnerability indices that have varying levels of complexity. But what I like about this is I can sit a planner or a community manager down with this plan and basically show them how it works. It's more easy to understand. Similarly, you can backtrack out what makes your community vulnerable. So if you have a high heat vulnerability index at a glance, and again, that's what we want to get people in with, is first, at a glance, is my community vulnerable? Then they can start to backtrack out which of these larger groups contribute disproportionately to their vulnerability. And then further back, what indicators? Maybe it's that they have a high rate of diabetes within their community, or maybe it's that they are living in the urban heat island. And then they can start to think about targeting interventions that can help reduce their vulnerability overall. Next, please. So leading up to all that, this is now the display of the New Jersey Heat Vulnerability Index. It's version 1.0. I'm always looking to improve it. And to help with interpretation, I've divvied this up into 20th percentile bins throughout the state. Basically, 1 in yellow here is the 20th percentile of the least vulnerable, and 5 here in the dark blue is the percentage, is the top 20th percentile that's the most vulnerable throughout the state. And there's a few things that we can look at as we start parsing through this. One, it kind of looks like the CDC's social vulnerability index, and that makes sense. Some of the components are the same, but we're tweaking it for extreme heat in particular. But we do see 2 big things that pop out. One, we see our urban heat islands really popping out. In northeastern and southwestern New Jersey, you see those dark blue areas. That's our more urbanized areas within the state. But it also highlights some of our rural southern areas. Now, again, if you want to look at this index and play around with it, it has a lot of fun functionalities where you can click on each one of the census tracts, and it'll give you a breakdown of all of its indicators and how they rank throughout the state. So it's very easy to see that process of how an individual area is more vulnerable. And I've included the link there. If you would go to the next one, please. But kind of as a first pass of looking at this, New Jersey, its Department of Environmental Protection has a definition of overburdened communities throughout the state. And these include communities with a high proportion of low-income households, high minority population, and limited English-speaking proficiency. You'll note those are kind of some of the things that filter into the heat vulnerability index as well. But if we look at how the state defines overburdened communities and their heat vulnerability, we find about 75% are within these 3 to 5 category, so the higher end. And if we look specifically just at low income, we see that they're in, majority of them are in these HVI categories 4 and 5, so the top 40th percentile. So that's not necessarily a surprise, but what this really emphasizes is, yes, we know that low-income households correlate with the HVI because I incorporated low-income communities. However, the fact that they're standing out so starkly shows that not only is it just income, but it's other compounding effects that go into it. It's income. It's the fact that many of our low-income communities are in our urban centers, and they tend to be minority population, et cetera, et cetera. And there are some areas where the overburdened communities have a low HVI, and that's primarily driven by socioeconomic factors. So it may have a high minority population, but that community tends to be well off, and so that tends to be the dividing line there. So could we go to the next one, please? So some of the key takeaways for the state of New Jersey is, while the HVI does look at the urban heat island, there are many more factors to consider. And what really stood out to me is when we start to look at that urban-rural divide, we find that Southern New Jersey ranks very highly in as well. And that's primarily due to sensitivity and adaptive capacity lacking. And that's driven by health and socioeconomic disparities. Folks in Southern New Jersey have higher rates of diabetes, asthma, as well as low income in general, compared to many other parts of the state. So when we think about the HVI itself, it can start to help us target interventions and adaptations for extreme heat moving forward that are unique to each one of the communities throughout the state. And one of the nice things about a heat vulnerability index is its flexibility. I've produced it here for the state of New Jersey, which is by and large pretty urban to suburban, but you can also target it into just a metropolitan region. For example, New York City has a very good heat vulnerability index that is focused specifically on its own neighborhoods. So it scales very well when you start to apply the methodology. So again, if you're interested in checking this out, I encourage you to look at our New Jersey HazAdapt website here, which we developed for the New Jersey Office of Emergency Management. It can give you some ideas about maybe some tools and the like that you would like to implement or see in your own communities. And speaking of other tools for climate change and adaptation, next, please. I also encourage you to check out our New Jersey Adapt suite of tools. They're data visualization and mapping tools made to assist planners and community leaders, all focused around climate change and its impacts and just the data that needs to come to bear to address those impacts. So I've included the link here, so you'll get the slides after the fact, or you'll get the recording and you can go there. But we have a number of different tools such as climate dashboard that provides just general climate information, a flood mapping tool set and mapping program that allows people to visualize where they may be impacted by sea level rise and the like. Climate snapshots by each municipality that summarizes their vulnerability across a number of different hazards, including extreme heat. The HazAdapt platform I've spoken to already, a planning tool for local communities that are not experts in climate change, as well as a forest adaptation tool where you can visualize a lot of other climate information. We also have a public health tool coming down the pike as well. So if you are interested in looking at those and getting some ideas about what you would maybe be able to implement in your own communities, if you like those tools, I really do encourage you to play around with them. They're very interesting. So with that, next slide, I'd like to say thank you. Here's my email, and then there's a thanks to all the other people that contributed to this work down here as well. So with that, Tim, I'll turn it back over to you. I have a number of backup slides for more information if it comes up in the questions, so you may need to skip ahead by about 5 or 6 slides.
Thank you very much, James. Lad, it's your turn.
Great. Thank you so much, Tim. And I believe we're running a little short on time, so I'll keep this fairly brief so we can get to our last speaker. I'm going to discuss the plan integration for resilient scorecard for heat, an approach that communities can use to better understand how all of their plans are working together to either exacerbate urban heat or mitigate urban heat. And I'm an assistant professor of planning at the University of Arizona, as mentioned before. My own research area is broadly heat policy planning and governance. But again, this particular talk is focused very much on urban heat at the local city scale. Next slide. So you've seen this graphic once before. It comes from the Planning for Urban Heat Resilience book that I authored with my colleague Sarah Miro at Arizona State University. We cover the whole range of how to holistically plan for heat at the city level, but we essentially define urban heat resilience as proactively mitigating and managing urban heat across the many systems and sectors that it affects. And I put this up just to say that what I'm going to focus on with the plan, the PERS for heat approach in the next couple of slides is focused very specifically onto heat mitigation, and that doesn't negate the importance of heat management strategies such as cooling centers, weatherization of homes, things like that too. But we're going to focus on urban heat mitigation for this talk. Next slide. So one really important idea here is that, of course, we know that cities adopt many plans, right? And so in the United States, we have comprehensive plans, we have climate action plans, you may even have heat action plans that are emerging in some places, but it's not one single plan that determines the future of the built environment. It's all of these plans working in concert together. So it's really this collection of community plans that shapes that future built environment. But unfortunately, due to lack of time, lack of resources, departmental silos, these plans are rarely coordinated together. And we have research showing, a great body of research showing that when these plans are not coordinated, there's missed opportunities to reduce conflicting priorities between those plans, and that unfortunately we can reduce or even have negative effects on hazard planning outcomes. And so some of the things that we're planning for in one area may actually exacerbate the hazards, of course, like putting homes in a floodplain, putting homes next to the wildland urban interface for wildland fire concerns. And for heat, the same thing is true. So increasing roadway lengths, developing a lot of new areas that take over green spaces. So kind of thinking of heat as a hazard similar to other climate hazards. Next slide. So this just shows that plan integration idea and those network of plans working together. And you can see that each of those plans is highlighting a different area and a different aspect of the built environment that it has a little policy lever over. And again, if you only looked at one of those plans, like that red transportation plan on the left-hand side, you'd be getting a very incomplete picture of the built environment. And heat action plans are kind of the same idea. They may control a lot of green space or have a lot of heat mitigation ideas, but they're not looking at broader urban development trends that may be planned out through the comprehensive plan that's in the lower portion with the orange. So really, again, it's just this idea that to understand what the future of the built environment looks like, you have to look at all of these plans. Next slide. So this is where the Plan Integration for Resilience Scorecard comes into effect. So this was developed by our colleagues at Texas A&M and UNC Chapel Hill, and it's the designated plan integration tool of choice by the American Planning Association and by FEMA. And it was originally developed for flood hazards. And due to time constraints, I won't go through all of the uses, but it's been used through research and practice to better increase flood resilience in many communities. So a lot of history there. Next slide. So my colleagues and I received a grant from NOAA to essentially adapt that PERS that was originally developed for flood hazards for heat hazards. And we piloted this PERS for heat with partner cities in Baltimore, Boston, Fort Lauderdale, Houston, and Seattle. All of those partnered with US NOAA on their heat mapping campaign. So that was one of the inputs that we used for the research. And we created this PERS for heat guidebook, which I'll put into the chat. And as I go through the methods really quickly, don't feel like you need to take notes because all of it is documented out very well in that PERS for heat guidebook. Next slide. So essentially a really quick overview of the process. The first thing you need to do is assemble those plans within that network of plans that affects the urban heat island. And the communities that we looked at for the pilot, those were often comprehensive plans, hazard mitigation plans, climate action plans, and then adaptation or resilience plans if they were available. Since then, we've also piloted in other communities and used transportation plans and park recreation plans too. So you can use any of the plans that comprise that network of plans. Then you do the policy scoring. So essentially you look through those plans and score those policies that affect heat positively or negatively. And you assign them a score of +1, 0, -1, or an unknown effect if it's not clear. And to be included in the analysis, these policies must pass what is called the 3-point test. So they have to either increase or reduce the amount of urban heat. They have to contain at least one mappable or place-specific term, so they could be mapped. And that could be citywide, and they have to contain a recognizable policy tool or a form of government intervention. So you have to tell us how you're actually achieving this. Then you go ahead and map those policies and create many tables and indices that could be given back to the cities or that the cities can use for themselves. And you essentially come up with a net scorecard map that shows policy attention to heat mitigation. And we did that on census tract districts. And so then you take that and you assess it, essentially, you analyze it against physical vulnerability and social vulnerability. So for physical heat hazard, we looked at the NIHIS heat mapping campaign. And for social vulnerability, we used the Social Vulnerability Index, which was requested by the cities, but you could easily use something like the heat vulnerability index that the previous speaker was talking about too. So if you have those more sophisticated vulnerability indices available, you can certainly use those in lieu of more general ones. And then once you have that comparison, you hopefully advance your heat resilience through updating your plans and policies in the future to make them more targeted to those hotter and most vulnerable areas, strengthen plan integration across that network of plans, and then of course share stories and breaking down those departmental silos that exist. Next slide. So very quickly, again, this is just a map of the cities that we've completed PERS for heat for, and we have many in progress right now. Next slide. And I'll go through this really quickly due to the time limitation, but again, we analyzed the plans for 5 cities. I've already mentioned the types of plans, and you can see the number of policies on the right-hand side. Next slide. And what's important here is that we also categorize the different types of policy tool categories that those policies come into place with. And this very much tracks with the literature and what we've seen in practice, where a lot of these heat mitigation policies are falling into capital improvements. So things like tree planting campaigns, parks, things like that. Less prevalent, but still prevalent, land use analysis and permitting and development regulations. And you can see the other policies kind of fall off very quickly after that. Next slide. We also categorize the different types of heat mitigation strategies that the cities were using. And surprisingly, the greatest number was in waste heat, although it's important to note that the policies were not necessarily intentionally having effect on heat, right? So we scored them based on their potential impact on heat, not whether they explicitly were being targeted to heat. And so there was a lot of policies about reducing automobile use, making buildings more energy efficient. So those ones came up a lot. And then urban greening and land use were the second 2 most prevalent heat strategy categories. Next slide. And you can see here the policy scores that I'll show on the next slide for the net PERS for heat map. And the important thing to note here is that we found very little policies that would clearly increase urban heat, but many policies that had an unknown effect because they were very much open to interpretation. And so just wanting to point out that we give the cities back this whole list of policies and flag those unknown policies and say that this is an opportunity as they approve developments or as they redo plans to make those policies more explicit so that they fall into that mitigating heat category and not unintentionally that increasing heat category. Next slide. And I'll just show one example here. So out of the 5 cities, Boston was the only city that had a statistical correlation between the census tracts where heat mitigation policies were focused on and those hottest census tracts and the census tracts that also had highest social vulnerability. So you can see the darker purple color on the left-hand side is essentially those census tracts that had those most attention to heat mitigation policies. The lighter color still had heat mitigation policies, but to a lesser extent than the darker purple colors. And in the case of Boston, they did a good job of aligning those very well with the hottest census tracts and also the most vulnerable census tracts. But again, that was one city out of the 5. The other 4 were not as good of stories, unfortunately. So that's an opportunity for these cities to more spatially think about those heat mitigation policies and where they're actually putting them into place. Next slide. So key findings from this project, heat mitigation is shaped by a network of plans. So we determined that certainly. Again, many policies were not explicitly linked to heat hazards, but have the potential to mitigate it. So an opportunity to promote co-benefits. And again, a lot of policies relating to reducing automobile waste heat or making buildings more energy efficient that were done for other reasons, but could be called heat mitigation strategies more clearly. The most frequent policy tools we found were capital improvements, land use analysis and permitting, and development regulations. And most frequent heat mitigation strategies were waste heat reduction, urban greening, and land use. Again, many of the policies had an unknown effect for heat mitigation, which is a call to clarify those policies. And then heat mitigation policies do not appear to consistently target the hottest or most vulnerable areas of cities, even though in many cases those were co-located with each other that we found. And again, Boston was the counterexample, so that's why I showed it, because it's kind of an interesting counterexample and kind of highlighting the good work that they've done. And I think the most important thing is that engagement through the PERS for Heat process has sparked some valuable conversations outside of just heat planning, but what is quality land use planning and how to make better worded policies. Next slide. And this is just my colleague Sarah Miro and I presenting our results to the city of Tempe previously. And again, we had a lot of those really good conversations where they kind of like went back to the drawing board and said, well, a lot of the policies that we actually have in our upcoming comprehensive plan aren't as specific enough. They're not place-based. And so we can improve planning, not just for heat, but for every policy across the whole comprehensive plan. So it kind of was a really nice learning opportunity. And again, kind of using PERS for heat to recognize gaps in policy-induced vulnerabilities for heat, strengthening plan integration through those future plan updates, and then again, sharing stories and lessons learned across all the cities that we're working with. Last slide. So we've already put those 2 links in the chat, but again, just doing a quick promo for our free resources, the Planning for Urban Heat Resilience book, which looks at both heat management and urban heat mitigation. The whole guidebook with the first 5 pilot city case study results is available for free too on the American Planning Association website. And want to thank our funders, NOAA, and of course, the Department of Energy. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Tim.
Thanks very much, lad. Very impressive. That's all. I think you're online. So take it away. We're still live, even though it's after 1 o'clock our time. So let's assume we can keep going.
Thanks, Tim. Is it okay if I share my screen?
Yeah.
Thank you.
To be able to do it now.
Yes, I can. Well, thank you all for joining today. I wanted to specifically thank Tim for organizing this particular session and inviting me in here. Julio, thanks a lot for anchoring this particular conference from our side. And again, thanks to all the participants and panelists for being here. I will talk about LEAD for communities and how heat island mitigation or heat mitigation strategies or projects are tackled by the projects in LEAD for cities and communities. We are running over time. LEAD for cities and communities is a rating system that was developed by U.S. Green Building Council. I was one of the persons developing it in 2016 and all. We launched it in 2016 and we had another version 2019. And now we are working on another version as well. So we are keeping it very agile, but you can see that this particular rating system is quite comprehensive, trying to capture all urban issues and try to work on it with existing cities and communities or cities and communities that are in planning and designing phase as well. So you can see here, this particular, we call it scorecard, is talking about a lot of performance related priorities. So we call it, we are making performance as a prerequisite, and the data-driven discussion makes an integral part of this kind of process, and people use credits to improve over time as well. So it is about continuously improving performance. And we are talking about, changing some of the planning pedagogy about this discussion as well. How do we really talk about continuous improving urban complexes, not only planning part of it. So this is about existing cities and communities. Similar aspects we are trying to promote in cities and communities in plan and design as well. And here also performance has been embedded right from the beginning in many of the prerequisites as well. So with that kind of background, so far we have more than 350 cities and communities certified globally, and we would be talking about some of them right now. So the tools that we all have been talking about today in this particular presentation, I would want to highlight a tool, but obviously we give credits while cities and communities get certified to LEAD. And that is where you can see about resilience planning and heat planning, heat island effect, and other extreme heat and cold kind of climatological disasters and impacts are a key part of the discussion, in which we talk about doing a vulnerability assessment, then capacity assessment, and then planning for it. Now, obviously, there are 6 points for it, and heat is one part of it. But when we talk about a city or a community at a large scale, we are trying to capture a holistic discussion, and that is where it's an integral part of the discussion. However, we have, to support some of these priorities, developed a resilience guide and how cities and communities are tackling urban heat island and so on and so forth are integral part of this particular. I will briefly highlight one example from one of our certified cities, Cambridge, Massachusetts. My previous panelists talked about Boston as well. So here, Cambridge is having nearly 40% of its land area covered by green infrastructure and tree canopy and open spaces and so on and so forth. And 100% of residents are in close proximity to some of these green aspects of it. They have a conservation commission. At the same time, they are putting various laws. You can see here it's been highlighted, and they are also they also have a great urban forestry management plan where they are trying to infuse various ordinances one after the other and trying to bring in funding into this particular process where they are trying to put tree replacement and so on and so forth. They are also doing a lot of large education campaign program as well. I'd like to talk about another project in Milan. It's a old World Expo project. I think World Expo took place in 2015, and now Landlease, one of the big developers, is right now trying to redevelop that 100-hectare site. These are two different specific projects within that 100-hectare site that they have initiated called Mind Westgate and Mind Village. And again, we'll be talking a little bit more about these two projects and their strategies that they are trying to put together to really think about heat mitigation. But I think heat mitigation is not only needs to be looked into it in a very kind of horse vision, but looked into it in a larger context. So I think that is where they are trying to, while they are working with Lead for Cities and Communities, they're also trying to work in other aspects, and heat is an integral part of it. You can see that is one of the big priorities that they have highlighted here in orange, urban flood and heat from the resilience point of view. So that is where they are trying to deploy a lot of, electrification, like 100% electrification kind of priorities. And then they are trying to go 100% renewable as well. But to really alleviate the risk related to heat waves, they are really talking about various specific strategies. Obviously, buildings are a key part of their discussion, but overall, site-wide also, they are trying to do various different strategies in landscape, etc., shading, and so on and so forth. They are also talking about a lot related to reducing cooling loads as well, and trying to do the load optimization as well. They are trying to really find out ways in which they do all these things, but at the same time, they need to optimize the cost as well. So you can see that they are trying to really have a 3-step process. It's not going to happen today. It's going to happen over time. And here, that's where they are trying to talk about putting efficient systems, but improving it over time as well. And that is a very simple analogy for it. And here, I think they are also trying to deploy some of the passive strategies. Like, as I said earlier, they are talking about various types of strategies and policies and technologies that are going to work with it. One simple example here on the right-hand side is about envelope and how they can really work with the skin of the building, meaning envelope, and then try to figure out how they can do other strategies as well. As you can see, they are also trying to connect it to grid, but trying to figure out how can they work with energy partners to have a comprehensive strategy so that they can really optimize the resilience through the life cycle, right from the day one, but obviously ongoing and improving over time as well. So with that, I just wanted to quickly end it here. Wanted to give you a quick perspective about 2 of our projects working on various aspects. We have, as I said, more than 350 projects, and there's a lot of different strategies. But I thought these 2 will quickly give you a kind of perspective on how Lead for Cities and Communities projects are working on some of the urban heat island kind of mitigation strategies. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Vatsal. Thanks to all of our speakers. These were great presentations. I know we've received one question in the chat from Julio that Rina Vivek has answered in the chat. I think Julio's question is similar to my own, which is to what extent have these tools that we've discussed been taken up by communities? Or are they just ideas? And and what are the trends in that regard? And are there improved ways that we can think of to disseminate, advertise these tools to communities through organizations like ISOCARP, the Urban Economic Forum, American Planning Association, USGBC, ICLE, et al. So I'll pose those questions to the speakers, and I don't know how much more time we're going to be allowed. Does anybody from the ISOCARP Congress organizers have an opinion about that?
Team, I think you should be good on timing because we're the last session of the day. And
Okay,
so in respect of everybody else, I mean, this session is recorded, and if you're needing to leave, they're welcome to and watch again the recording later.
right. I see we've lost a few people already. Why don't I say that I'll take 3 respondents from among the speakers, and then we'll leave it at that. How about that? Who would like to raise their hand first? Noting that I can call on you. Okay, Lad, thank you very much.
Yeah, so in addition to Rena's really good answer in the chat, I would just say that, 4 or 5 years ago, many cities were still not thinking about planning for heat or thinking that it was something that government should even be responsible for, right? So I think we have seen a major shift in the last couple of years, and I've been working on this issue for at least 10 years, right? So I think we've certainly seen a shift that governments are interested in it. I don't think it's so much the lack of tools or information that's available, but the fact that we're kind of adding yet another thing that cities have to do without the resources or the capacity to do them. So I think that's one of the bigger stumbling blocks. And I think a lot of new processes and institutions, essentially what many of us call heat governance, still is in very early days, right? And so we have 3 chief heat officers here in the United States, so 3 dedicated staff focused on kind of coordinating those efforts at the city level. But in the United States, again, we have 19,000 communities that need some sort of way to address heat, and it's not practical or reasonable to think that we'll have 19,000 heat officers in the United States. So we need other forms of governance that allows those smaller communities and medium-sized communities to address heat without adding a new director that they probably can't afford in many cases, right? And the last thing I'll say is, I know we're a little bit focused at the city level, just based on the audience, but states and regional governments and national governments have a really large role to play too. And so in the United States, this summer, we saw for the first time Arizona and Louisiana both declared heat emergencies that freed up some state resources to help local governments. And we also have efforts by our national government here in the United States to do things like add heat safety labor laws to our workforce safety standards. So that's going through the process right now. And there's a couple of other bills that are proposed to better incorporate heat into how we govern different climate risks. But again, the disparity from how much we spend on heat compared to flooding or wildfire, when in many places in the world heat's the #1 weather-related killer, is vastly that's the problem. It's not so much the interest or the information, but it's the resources available, right? So
Okay, great, thank you. James, I'll put you on the spot. I know your Rutgers Heat Vulnerability Index is fairly new, but I am very curious, also being a New Jersey resident, to what extent towns and counties might have started utilizing it in some way.
Right now, it's been utilized mostly as a novel thing to look at. So here in New Jersey, each municipality is required to have a hazard mitigation plan, and the state has indicated that climate change needs to be a consideration within that. And so, that has a very big bucket. The problem here in New Jersey is climate change means coastal flooding. Climate change means rainfall-driven flooding. It doesn't necessarily mean heat-related hazards in the minds of planners and practitioners yet. That's one of the things that we're actually looking at on my research end is, we're in like pretty moderate climate here, how is our heat impacts actually going to change moving forward? So I would say our tools writ large, our NJ-ADAPT tools, have been fairly well integrated, especially for our municipalities that don't have the funding or the person power to go out and like do surveys and stuff themselves to find their own or hire an engineering firm. So that's where that climate action plan, or sorry, the climate guidance tool that we have comes into play. So we're working on how to tune that to help communities work with extreme heat, and within that, we're nesting the HVI within that. But that's still kind of a work in progress. But yes, we've seen a lot of engagement around our other tools. So I anticipate as the question around extreme heat in New Jersey becomes a bit more focused, kind of what Lad was saying, it's still kind of nascent a little bit, or like it's still in its beginning years, people starting to pay attention to it, especially in a place like New Jersey where it doesn't historically have as much of a focus on that. So I do anticipate seeing more action out of it, but primarily it'll be through our other tools that ask people to reference back to the HVI to see how they can shape their hazard mitigation plan and target interventions moving forward.
Okay, all right, thank you. It sounds like heat vulnerability is an issue, but addressing it is a newer thing, and maybe you're paving the way. And despite your new job at the World Bank, you may end up getting involved in something along those lines. What do you think?
Well, I think many cities have the same challenges. Now they're trying to find a solution, like all-in-one solution to deal with so many problems at the same time. So, for example, in Boston, I remember that the poor communities are more vulnerable to heat island effect, even though those areas not so concrete dense compared to the city centers. That's a Boston problem. And here in Ho Chi Minh cities, so I just mentioned that the city cut off all of the trees to be roads, which increase the heat island effects. But at the same time, just yesterday there was a storm, and there's a lot of like big trees falling down, which like bring properties and human damage. So there's so many problems at the same time, and now the city is struggling to find which way should the city planner should like the solution where people can solve multi problem at the same time. And also it's not easy for existing city. If you plan the new city, it would be more flexible to adopt new methodology to new solution. But for existing city, for the city have some history, is even harder. So I think now we don't have a lot of good practice yet, but we're trying to solve like problem one by one, but at the same time need to be comprehensive and holistic. That is the hard part.
Okay, thanks very much. Sounds like we're a wrap, as we say in Hollywood. We have speakers leaving the screen already. Thank you very much to everybody again. I think our bios are in one of the first documents in the chat with our email addresses. And later on, Isocarp will make available the recordings and the slide deck. So I'm hoping that everybody can make use of all these resources. That was our intent. And if you're going to the in-person Congress, October 10th through 13th, and I hope you will, despite having joined this free Congress virtual session, I hope to see you there because I'm planning to go as well. And thank you again very much, and have a good day.
Thank you. If you can turn on your cameras just for to have a last screenshot for this session. Thank you, everyone. Smile. One more. Oi. You
Yeah.
moved, yeah. Okay,
So they're not robots.
okay,
All right.
perfect. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.